I think perhaps about maybe 60% of people in Malaysia, if I'm not wrong, are Muslim. And that's quite a large number, obviously. And so any socialist movement in any part of the world where there's a large body of Muslims has to be aware of this movement that we can call Islamic fundamentalism, although academics prefer to use the term political Islam because they feel this term in particular is more loaded. But what is it? And what are its class origins? Where does it come from? And is it really representative of Islam, or is it something quite different? Let's have a look. When we look at academia, you'll see that given that in academia, postmodernism has come to dominate the left of the political spectrum, which is most unfortunate, they tend to look at the entire scenario of political Islam only from the point of view of discourse. So what they want to examine is what discourses, how the discourse basically excludes one or another or marginalizes one or another identity. So in that sense, then they could talk about in the context of, let's say, patriarchal discourse, that it would otherize and marginalize women within the context of the discourse. And similarly, in European discourse, they could marginalize and otherize those who belong to the Muslim faith. But this is a tricky sort of situation, because in this scenario, although postmodernists are against the creation of binaries, they do in fact create these binaries of what is included in the discourse versus what is excluded or what is otherized in the discourse. But in fact, when we talk about something as broad or as big as a society or a religion, we are not just talking about a singular construct here. We are talking about a complex entity. So if we're talking about Pakistan, if I'm otherizing Pakistan, now while I admit that a discourse can otherize another country, an ethnicity, another people of another religion, but to just push that all into one category in relation to another one is to, of course, not fail to recognize that that society, that religion itself is composed of a lot of different trends, a lot of different ideas. Not that that isn't true for the question of women. It most certainly is. So for that reason, I find this particular way of looking at a political Islam to be not very convincing and not very insightful even. And moreover, if I'm just examining discourse, if I'm just examining narrative, without really looking at who this narrative serves, what purpose it serves in that particular society, then I'm also not able to understand really what is actually happening, because narratives can be somewhat misleading. What I really need is a class analysis of what's going on and an intellectual history of what's going on. So the term fundamentalism is, although used pejoratively many times in the world today, didn't necessarily start out that way. In fact, Protestant Christians chose this term for themselves because they said they believe in the fundamentals of the literal interpretation of the Bible. Now, the Bible was being challenged, or at least let's say, a certain narrative in the Bible, that is, certain literal interpretations of the Bible were being challenged by the development of 19th and early 20th century science. In particular, Christians felt challenged by Darwin's theory of evolution. So they were very much opposed to that. You can see over here, this is the headquarters of the Anti-Evolution League. And they also wanted to support the Christian fundamentalists, the second coming of Jesus Christ in a literal sense, Christ's virgin birth, resurrection, atonement, and so on. So the fundamentalist movement really began, and the term began with Protestant Christians within the United States of America. And for lack of a better term, therefore, the European Academy began to use the same term, or the Western Academy began to use the same term when they saw a somewhat similar phenomena in the Muslim world. They began to call that Islamic fundamentalism. Now, some people think that the term fundamentalism would be, would put them down, and therefore political Islam is better. But the term now has such widespread usage that I think it makes sense to continue with that at some level. Also because the implication of using political Islam is that the other question is then the other kind of Islam is not political, which is not necessarily the case. A little bit of a quick history here. When the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, when he, in the process of making the revolution in Medina and then later in Makkah, several different forms of authority were concentrated and focused in one person. So he was, in that sense, the spiritual leader of the community, but he was also the political leader of the community. He was also the leader in war. So he was also the, you could say, the chief of army staff of the community. And he was also the Supreme Court and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was the chief arbiter in terms of all juridical conflicts within Medina as well. So power was focused in this one individual. Of course, the community was rather small. But as Islam developed, this situation could not have remained as it was. So in about 200 years of its development, we rapidly see that these functions began to devolve on different, not just individuals, but on different institutions altogether. The role of being the spiritual head of the community at first was taken up by the Khalifa, but later a conflict developed between the ulama and the Khalifa. This was in the period of Al-Mamun in the Abbasid period, which is about the 9th century, early 9th century. In fact, there was a big civil war in that period. And there was an attempt by the Khalifa of that period to create what you would consider to be the Jamia discourse or the Mu'tazila discourse as the state ideology of that time, which was a kind of a rational theology. And this was resisted by the people you could characterize as the more traditional ulama. And there was a big conflict between the two, which went on for a while, between the Khilafat and the ulama. The final result of that, in fact, was that the argument that the ulama made was that you are the political head, the head of the government is the Khalifa, but the spiritual head of the community will not be the political head of the community. So they separated that from political office. And as a result, unlike Christianity, Islam had a very decentralized form of spiritual control. So unlike Christianity, where you had the Catholic Church, which really unified most of the, not all, but most of the Christian churches in the Middle East, as well as, of course, in Europe. In Islam, you had no such similar institution at all. So you had 4 major Sunni schools of jurisprudence. You had, at least 2 different forms of Shia jurisprudence. And in addition, you had the Ibadi school, which came out of the Khariji school, etc. We won't get into the complicated history here. But the point nonetheless is that you had many, many different kinds of schools of thoughts within Islam that were called mazhabs. So the religion itself is called a deen, but the juridical school of thought was called a mazhab. And so Islam had a more decentralized flavor. And now the understanding between the political state and the spiritual institutions of within Arabia was such that, in fact, as a result of this division of labor, the political institution became not entirely secular, but mainly concerned with political questions and administrative questions. And the spiritual questions and religious questions were therefore now devolved to a decentralized body of ulama that were managing the whole situation. So you can see somewhat that although you didn't have the kind of church-state separation that you did in the Roman Empire, where the church was a separate institution and the state was a separate institution, but you had somewhat of a similar situation where you had decentralized ulama and then, of course, you had the state. When colonialism burst into the third world and into the Muslim world, if you read a very good book by William Dalrymple called The Anarchy, he details how the East India Company completely devastated the Mughal aristocracy that used to rule India. And he shows what they do to the old Muslim elite And I tell you that I have no sympathy for that old Muslim elite, which was basically, you could call it feudal, or you could call it, they were big landowners and so on. But when you read that book, what they do to that feudal elite, you begin to have some sympathy for them. What colonialism does to them. It destroys, really, the political class that really held power in the Mughal Empire. Now, as that class is destroyed, and as they no longer have the capacity now to fight against the British, the final nail in the coffin was given in 1857 when there was a mutiny. And in the mutiny, against the British, in their own forces, and in the mutiny, they thought that they could bring back the old Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar. It never happened. I mean, they tried for a bit, but they lost. And that was the final nail in the coffin. After that, the Mughal Empire is completely finished in India, 1857. So this brings about somewhat of a crisis of faith and also of politics. And in the vacuum, as the political class is decimated, let's say, by imperialism, in that vacuum steps forward the ulama class on the one hand, to fill that vacuum, to say, well, the political class is devastated. So who's going to do Muslim politics now? We are going to step into that position. On the other hand, you see that the British themselves try to create and do manage to create within India and other parts of the Muslim world as well, although India is not necessarily just Muslim, as you know, minority Muslim. But in other parts of the Muslim world as well, they try to create a class of people that would be loyal to the British, that would be able to understand the intellectual framework, the political, economic framework of capitalism, parliamentary democracy, and work closely with the British. So what you see then is the emergence of these two competing classes. One supported by the British, trained in Western thinking and so on, and the other is the ulama that come forward in the vacuum created by the destruction of the political class of Muslims. Now, naturally, imperialism and capitalism would engender its own contradictions and crises. The aspirations that the British themselves create and capitalism itself creates results in a section of the British trained intelligentsia breaking from that particular model of development, not only asking for political independence, but asking for a lot more, asking for economic independence. Perhaps the first major breach in this regard was made by Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1952, when sections of the Egyptian military took over, deposed the king, and instituted land reform and wanted to be done with feudalism because they wanted to modernize the military and they wanted to modernize the society after the defeat in 1948 in the first Arab-Israeli war. One could make the argument, though, that an earlier breach was made by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk when he saw how the European powers were taking apart Britain and France, the Ottoman Empire, and he too wanted to modernize the military, and not just therefore the military, but all of society. So these were breaches that were being made in the 20th century already. But in the mid-20th century, in the post-World War II period, in the post-war period, these breaches then decided to ally themselves with the Soviet Union. One cannot characterize this movement as a proletarian movement, but rather as a national bourgeois movement that wanted to achieve the economic and political modernization and cultural modernization of their societies, and felt that that wasn't possible within the framework of imperialism, and hence decided that they would, in some form or another, ally themselves with the Soviet Union. It was largely the same in India with respect to Nehru. These trends, Sukarno, Nehru, Gamal Nasser, Kwame Nkrumah here, and also you see Mr. Joseph Broz Tito, came together in the mid-1950s, in 1955, at Bandung to create the non-aligned movement. And non-alignment, of course, meant that they would utilize the power of the Soviet Union against imperialism to wrest from imperialism certain vital and key economic concessions and attain independence, economic independence vis-a-vis the former colonial powers. One of the key questions, for example, in the case of Egypt, was the Suez Canal. Without nationalizing the Suez Canal, it was clear that Egypt would not be able to achieve economic development because it belonged mainly to Britain and France, and minority shares belonged to the Egyptians themselves, although they had already paid many times over for the building of the canal. A similar question erupted in Iran, where the government of Muhammad Mossadegh, the National Front, understood correctly that without changing the relationship with the British oil companies, they could not hope to achieve the industrialization of Iran because they could not utilize those resources for their own benefit at all. So these were certain very key economic demands that ignited the Muslim world, and rapidly this idea of non-alignment spread that this should be and ought to be the new economic model for these newly independent Muslim states and third world society. You could call this a national liberation movement or the continuity of the national liberation project. And let's try and understand that these were absolutely vital for the economic and political development of these societies. Absolutely vital. That's why there was a huge and broad consensus across these societies, although not universal, but certainly the vast majority of people supported these kinds of demands. So this resulted in, on the one hand, a Nasserite movement erupting across the Middle East. And I cannot explain to you how popular Gamal Nasser was in the 1950s and 60s in the Arab-speaking world. It's very difficult for me to explain, but let me give you a small metaphor. When he would make his speeches on radio, they would say that even in Saudi Arabia, the streets would go completely empty because everybody would go home to listen to Nasser's speech on their radio. Radios at that time used to be larger than televisions, as you know. Now you have, you could listen to the radio on your cell phone, but at that time you had to go home to listen to radio. So everybody would go home. And so this had a huge impact. Even Pakistan in the 1970s, basically decided to go non-aligned. The United States of America and its allies, Britain and France now, were very, very concerned about this non-alignment. They didn't like it. They thought that although they recognized that these people were not necessarily communists in that traditional sense, but from their perspective, they were communist enough such that they had to be repressed, the movement had to be broken. They were not willing to join imperialism in the old project of containment of communism, either with respect to the Soviet Union or with respect to the newly formed People's Republic of China. They were all demanding that China should now sit on its seat in the United Nations and so on. And of course, the Americans were recognizing the government in Taiwan. So a reactionary pole was created around certain regimes where they had managed to install governments that were pro-Western. That was in Iran, Jordan, Iraq, Pakistan. This was called the Central Treaty Organization. And its purpose was basically to counter, on the one hand, the forces of Gamal Nasser, and on the other hand, the Ba'athist upsurge in the Middle East, which had started from Syria and had also spread to Iraq, where there was a revolution later against the government of Nouri al-Said, etc. So CENTO was a military pact aimed mainly against Egypt and its allies. Similarly, another pact was created called CENTO, and that was a pact involving Southeast Asia as well as Pakistan. And the purpose there was to encircle the People's Republic of China and also to prevent the Vietnamese Revolution and so on. So many of the monarchies, including Saudi Arabia, etc., also now allied themselves with the United States and the Western Bloc against not just communism, but against this entire national liberation movement. So if you look at the map of the Middle East, you see that perhaps this whole drama, this whole historical drama would have been insignificant or would have been considered unimportant, except for the fact that this is where the oil resources, the major oil resources of the world are. If you look at the yellow dots, that is where you find the oil fields in the Middle East. So you can see that they are stretching all the way from there in Syria, all the way across Iraq down to the eastern coast of Saudi Arabia, all the way down till here. This is the belt of oil that you see. And that's why this has to be controlled. This has to be controlled because oil, of course, is the power that drives the late capitalist economy. The economy cannot survive without oil, at least not in the period that we're talking about. Maybe in the 21st century, that will change. So Middle East became very, very important. Now, in this scenario where on the one hand, you see this nationalist upsurge or national liberation upsurge in the form of Nasirism and Baathism and other non-aligned movements pushing against imperialism for economic independence. That's the first major factor. You've seen that in an earlier period, the political class of the Muslims the traditional political class of the Muslims has been decimated, leaving that space open for the ulama to occupy. So what do you see now? You see the emergence of a new kind of movement, spearheaded roughly in the same period by three major intellectuals: Sayyid Qutb of Egypt, Maulana Maududi of Pakistan, and Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran. Khomeini comes out of the traditional Shia training. In fact, Sayyid Qutb and Maulana Maududi are self-taught in this regard. They're steeped in the Islamic tradition, but they don't come from what we call traditional Islam. What do I mean by that? Traditional Islam, and Khomeini also, although he comes from traditional Islam, is basically quite different from the traditional interpretation of Shiaism. So the traditional Islam thought our work and our job is to take care of the spiritual aspects of the ummah, the community. The politics is going to be done by the state. That's not our job. That's their job. This was let's say, the social contract that was developed in the 9th century. We'll take care of the community, you take care of politics. You, the Khalifa, should not interfere in the spiritual matters of the community. Don't tell us what to do, how to pray, what is the right doctrine or what is the wrong doctrine. That's not your job. You do your fighting and your wars, and you safeguard the territories, and you make sure that the rule of law is followed and all of that stuff, and fight go to war and try to conquer Christian Europe, etc. But don't tell us about spirituality. And we won't bother you with the war and everything. We'll support you in the war, in your war efforts and so on and so forth. We won't challenge your authority in the political domain, but we will manage the spiritual side of society. We will teach people how Islam is to be followed. This was the traditional division of labor. So what these three individuals did is to change that balance entirely. Their main thesis was that it is to restrict religion to the sphere of society is in fact the wrong interpretation of Islam. And the correct interpretation of Islam is that it is our religious duty, in fact, to create an Islamic state. In other words, the ulama must now step into the role that they traditionally gave up in the 9th century, into the role as the political leaders of the Muslim community. You see that? You see the transition here? It's very important for us to understand this, because this is then what divides what I call the Islamic traditionalists from the Islamic fundamentalists. Now, even today you will find, if you find an Islamic traditionalist movement, they will often say, yes, they will be just as orthodox as the fundamentalists, let's say, in all religious matters, but they are not concerned in political participation. They're not trying to get into power as such. They are managing their communities, they are managing their villages and so on. They have vast networks, etc. But they are not directly vying for political power. Whereas the fundamentalists have said that for every Muslim, it is now a religious obligation to try to bring Islam to power. What that technically means, of course, is, if you deconstruct that, it is the obligation of Muslims to try to bring the ulama class to political prominence and power within the Muslim community. That is the main changeover, switchover that these three individuals introduce. And they go about it in different ways because, of course, Khomeini is from the Shia school of thought. So he introduces his own idea of what is the walayat, etc. Maududi, who belongs to, relatively the Sunni jurisprudence, and Hanafi jurisprudence, goes about it in a different way, and similarly with Sayyid Qutb. So those are the main ideas that they now have to push aside these secular leaders of the Muslim states. And who are those leaders in the 1950s and 60s who are the most popular, sought out leaders? Those are, of course, the leaders that are heading the national liberation movement. Nasir, people like Gamal Nasir, the Baathists, and others. So now, because of the incredible popularity of these leaders, the religious fundamentalist movement decides, and because of the opposition that the Americans have to the national liberation movement, the religious fundamentalists decide that they will ally themselves with imperialism in order to counter the national liberation movement. And that is in fact what they begin to do. They begin to use theology as a means to counter the national liberation movement, and for that reason, they become very, very useful to US imperialism and to Western imperialism as a whole. Extremely useful. In the larger scheme of things, in the Cold War, the religious fundamentalist movement is now allied to imperialism. Now, this has to be distinguished again from the religious traditionalist movement. Some of the traditionalists, in fact, did not ally themselves with imperialism, but in fact even decided to ally themselves with the left in many instances. This opens up a number of questions between the secular leaders and the fundamentalist movement. One of the key questions, of course, is women's empowerment. What will be the role of women? Another one is, in the context of Pakistan at least, is blasphemy laws, etc. A third one is what will be the status and rights of non-Muslims in Muslim majority societies, and so on. So here is Mr. Nasir. In the context of Egypt then, the religious fundamentalist movement, that is the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Brotherhood of Muslims, not only opposes the Wafd, which is the traditional bourgeois party of, constitutional bourgeois party of Egypt, but more importantly comes in opposition to Nasir. It's created in the 1920s by the British and the monarchy to block the path of the democratic and secular Wafd. It's supported by them. And they tried to, at one time, assassinate Gamal Nasir. And they fail in that assassination attempt. They fire 6 bullets at him, but they don't manage to kill him. He continues with his speech. And that causes his popularity to rise immensely. And then there's a trial of the Ikhwan leaders in which they are found guilty of trying to assassinate the president of Egypt, and the death sentence is given to Sayyid Qutb, which of course creates a divide between the secular national liberation movement, the Nasirites, and the Ikhwan al-Muslimin that still has not finished. In Iraq and Syria, you see that the US supported at first the Baath party to crush the Iraqi CP, the Communist Party of Iraq, which was one of the largest communist parties in the context of the Middle East. Then they supported the Iraqi regime to crush the Iranian revolution. And when the Iraqis were almost successful in crushing the Iranians, then of course they supported the Iranians to fight back against the Iraqis. So this is all part of history. We all know this now. And finally, they crushed the Baathist regime in Iraq, which they themselves had supported to crush the communists, as well as used to crush the Iranian revolution. They crushed that very regime itself after Saddam invaded Kuwait. And that, of course, caused the death of 1 million people in Iraq and the devastation of that society. The result of this entire scenario was that Iraq, which was a secular society, mainly supported Arab nationalism and Baathism, has now ISIS and other fundamentalist groups that are very strong in this region. And then ISIS, of course, began to attack the Syrian secular regime, which is also Baathist, and infiltrated into the FSA, that is the Free Syrian Army, which the Americans were supporting. So on the one hand, while they were saying in Iraq, we don't want the ISIS, in Syria, we want the ISIS. Very, very weird. These kinds of alliances in the Middle East are so strange that in Iraq, for example, the government of Iraq is pro-Iranian and pro-US, but Iran itself is anti-US and US is against Iran. It is just a jumble of contradictions. Palestine was also extremely central to what was going on in the Middle East and to Islamic fundamentalism. Arafat, who headed an organization called Al-Fatah, the Victory, allied himself with other leftist organizations like the DFLP, the PFLP, the PPP, that's the Palestinian Communist Party, Palestinian People's Party, and many, many other leftists. And through Syria and other countries was receiving Soviet arms to fight Israel. And in that particular context, Israel began to support Sheikh Yassin in Gaza to counter the PLO. And they would regularly say that nationalism is against Islam and Palestinian nationalism doesn't make any sense, and so on, and we should not be fighting, there should not be armed struggle, we should just be working for reforms. But by 1988, the situation in Gaza as well as in the occupied territories had become so bad. And as a new generation of people came forward, younger people came forward, they began to fight the Israelis with stones and in the streets, etc., young people. So from Sheikh Yassin's movement, as these young people got more radicalized against Israel and they wanted to fight, came Hamas, which developed out of Sheikh Yassin's Ikhwan, etc. And now, as you know, since October 7th, Hamas and Israel have been at war. But Israel has always attempted to utilize Hamas, which is an Islamic fundamentalist organization, against the PLO to get them to fight each other so that Israel's security can be guaranteed. In Pakistan, you had a figure by the name of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Although he was very close to the then secular military dictator, he was a man who could see which way the tide of history was turning. He saw what was happening with Nasirism, with Baathism, what was happening with Nehru in India. He could see what was happening in Iran. And he also then went the path of trying to create a non-aligned movement in Pakistan, opposed to Ayub Khan, whom he used to support before, and created the Pakistan People's Party, which was a left of center party, called itself Socialist. But its main plan was, of course, not to overthrow the state in a Leninist style, but really to bring about similar reforms to what Nasser had done, what Mossadegh had done, what Nehru had done. So he nationalized many of the large-scale industries and did a land reform and so on. And in Pakistan, the opposition to him was in a certain sense spearheaded by Maulana Maududi and the Islamic fundamentalists. And when there was a revolution right next door in Afghanistan, when the communists came to power in Afghanistan, the Americans in a big way, the CIA in a big way, began to support the Islamic fundamentalists against the Afghan communists. This is Noor Muhammad Taraki, who was the leader of the Afghan communists. And this created one of CIA's largest operation in its own history, which was called Operation Cyclone. And you know, cyclone is something that destroys everything. And you can see that they named it correctly because it destroyed everything in its path. Afghanistan was devastated. Today, Afghanistan is a safe haven for Islamic fundamentalism. The Taliban are back in power after 20 years of US occupation. They spent, 20 trillion on that. 20 years they stayed there, and the result was that they replaced the Taliban with the Taliban. Thank you. Great. Nothing came out of that, 20 years. So, and the result on Pakistani society was similarly very, very negative. In Bangladesh, you had Sheikh Mujib, who was again a secular left-wing leader, not a communist or anything, but just left of center, much like Bhutto, although Bhutto and he didn't get along for different reasons. He spearheaded the Awami League, and he is known there as the father of modern Bangladesh. Although recently, in opposition to Sheikh Hasina, his daughter, some of his statues were broken down, etc. But he led the movement in Bangladesh for the independence of Bangladesh, and Bangladesh did become independent. And the Jamaat-e-Islami in Bangladesh was totally opposed to the independence of Bangladesh from East Pakistan, or from Pakistan rather, they were East Pakistan. And so the Awami League and the Jamaat-e-Islami have always, since that time, have never seen eye to eye. They've always been opposed to each other. And now what happened that's very significant is that in 1975, if I'm not mistaken, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and most of his family was killed in a brutal military coup. He was murdered. And only his daughter and one other relative survived, who then went on to mount an opposition campaign, and she was Sheikh Hasina, and later became Prime Minister of Bangladesh. So here as well, you see Islamic fundamentalists being opposed to what we would consider to be at that time the nationalist movement of Bangladesh. I've mentioned already Iran, but I'll mention it briefly again. Mossadegh came to power, nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil company. And you can see that in the poster over there, and you can see the oil company at the back, right? Iranians fighting against imperialism. And the Shah the imperialism basically worked with the Shah not only to overthrow Mossadegh's government. There's a very funny incident here, which I must tell you. It is that the first time they tried to do a coup against Mossadegh, they got a couple of units of the army and they came to the Prime Minister's residence to overthrow him. And Mossadegh had already found out, he was a very, very intelligent man, very well read, etc. He'd already found out that this is happening. So he was very calmly sitting in his home, and the doorbell rang. He opened the door, etc. And there were some, army people standing in front, and they said, "Mr. Mossadegh, we have to take you under custody." And Mossadegh very calmly replied, "Sir, I'm afraid I have to take you under custody." And from the bushes sprang forward, security forces that were in favor of Mossadegh, and they took him they took the people who had come to make the coup, they arrested those people, etc. So he managed to, avert the first coup, but then, imperialism decided to create further chaos in Iran to overthrow the government, and they were successful. This is, I believe, called Operation Ajax. So that's what happened in Iran. So the fundamentalists in Iran were also totally opposed to the National Front and to the left there. In Turkey, similarly, we saw the rise of Hizb ut-Tahrir against the Kemalists, who are very nationalist, very repressive, very anti-left, but also secular. So the Hizb ut-Tahrir wanted to restore the Khilafat in Turkey. And with respect to socialism and communism, of course, the Islamic fundamentalist was always opposed to us, to all the left. After September 11th, the Islamic fundamentalist movement now split into two parts. Because communism was no longer considered a major threat to imperialism, here's a little bit of news, it's still a major threat, but because it was no longer considered a major threat after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Islamic fundamentalists basically split into two parts. One part, under the leadership of Osama bin Laden, now wanted to fight against US imperialism itself. The other part said, what we won, we're happy with, and we just want to consolidate that. However, now this has created a bit of a confusion, because with the war on terror and the United States saying that they are going to reverse Islamic fundamentalism, many people think that Islamic fundamentalism is now anti-imperialist. But I want to submit to you that not only is it the fact that throughout the period of the Cold War were Islamic fundamentalists in favor of imperialism, and in fact helped to consolidate imperialism and oppose the movement that was fighting imperialism. But even more importantly, they have no fundamental conception of what imperialism really is. For example, they don't link it in any way, shape or form to the mode of production, to property relations. In other words, to capitalism. They want to have capitalism and get rid of imperialism. How is that ever going to happen? It's impossible. So if we do a class analysis out of this entire history that I've presented to you, now here comes the conclusion. If you do a class analysis of what Islamic fundamentalism is, Islamic fundamentalism are those remnants of the old ulama class from a previous pre-capitalist mode of production that are trying to utilize the contradictions on the one hand occupying the space emptied by the destruction of the political class, of the original traditional political class in the Muslim states, the sultans and the khalifas, etc. On the one hand, they're trying to occupy that space. On the other hand, they're trying to utilize imperialism to defeat not only communism, but even also the national liberation movement. And what they want to bring in its stead, though they may not consciously realize it or state it or say it, because in history, one can be the unconscious tool of something. Without realizing what you're doing something. What they're really fighting for is a world that is already slipping from their fingers, that is already evaporating in front of their eyes. It also explains the despondency sometimes that you find in Islamic fundamentalist circles despite their incredible success. It's a world slipping from their fingers because it's a world that they want to bring back, which really has been undermined by the flow and ebb of history, by the development of history itself. They want to go back to a pristine period which existed before the emergence of capitalism. But is it possible for us to go back in history in that way? Perhaps in war-torn Afghanistan, where industry is devastated, agriculture is devastated, you can go back to a period of history before the rise of industrial capitalism. But wherever you find capitalism moving forward, you will also find that it will bring with it its own culture, its own politics, its own thought processes, its own way of life. And although the fundamentalist movement tries to accommodate itself to that way of life, they try to create Islamic banking, they will try to create an Islamic political system, they will try to create Islamic fashion, Islamic capitalism, and so on. But it's a project that would be, in my view, a reactionary, anti-historical kind of utopia in their own mind. It really cannot come to exist. It really cannot stand before the tide of history. And so it is our task really to explain to people that their emancipation and the path forward does not lie in Islamic fundamentalism or in imagining that one can go backwards in time to a pristine period in history where things were great and wonderful and pure, but rather that we must, in a Hegelian sense, go forward in history. And in moving forward in history, we may find that what we hold dear from the past, what the spirit of egalitarianism that we continue to hold dear from the past, we may find that in a dialectical negation of negation, we create that society, but not in the past, in the future, in communism. Thank you so much.